So, welcome, Kristen Meili, to our podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I love it. Okay, so you have mentioned that your vision for your sex ed reclaim came to you through prayer in November of 2021. So, take me back to that moment and what were you seeing in the world around you that kind of inspired you to oh, we need something like that?
Well, I wasn't seeing anything around me, or I certainly wasn't keeping my eyes open to that. I was actually just in my own headspace, grieving the loss of like our overseas mission field and a new chapter in life that I wasn't really prepared for, and the loss of the jobs I had on the mission field. And so I was fully in my own head and in grief. But thankfully, I was in prayer and praying quite a bit and really just depressed. And that's when Sex Ed Reclaimed came to like fruition and in a vision. I actually bought the domain for my website the day after I had the vision. And it was totally from the Lord because I just knew I couldn't think of that. That wouldn't be something that I made up or thought of. I wasn't naturally an entrepreneurial spirit. And yet, the second it came to me, it just made so much like sense piece by piece of filming all the lessons I'd ever taught and putting them online. It was later I realized that that would really help a lot of homeschoolers and, people who had pulled their kids from public school environments and really meet parents where they were at. I honestly wasn't thinking about that at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting as in leading up to this recording, how many times I have heard this week. Okay, so I'm ready to have the talk. Like, what exactly does that look like, right? And then just having that discussion around and how important it is to have the talk throughout their whole life. It's not like one big thing. But I love that you have that ability to if for some reason you haven't had any conversations around that, that you can kind of pick up from there and then move on. I think that's really awesome.
Yes, it's great. It's a totally new way for many parents to frame this conversation. It's nothing like what we had growing up or the majority of us experienced. It's nothing like purity culture. It's nothing like the talk. It's nothing like birds and bees metaphors or super awkward conversation or like avoiding the conversation by giving these little white lies as answers. None of that. It's totally the opposite of all of it. It's a full conversation. It's not little white lies. It's honest. It's age appropriate. It's not awkward. It's comfortable. And it's multiple talks over the course of their childhood.
Yeah, totally. So, what do you think is the difference between a Christian sex education as well as from a secular education point standpoint? What are some of the differences that you teach, and what are some of those kind of things?
There are big differences because we all teach out of our worldviews and what we feel or think is truth. And if your truth is the way, the truth in the life, you're going to teach this topic differently than if your truth is I don't know, just kind of a general sense of love and happiness and, affirmation and that kind of stuff. And so I think the big difference, or a way I can sum it down, is that sex ed reclaimed, or the sex ed that I teach, that is from a Christian perspective, it incorporates what God is telling us about our bodies, about dating, relationships, about respect. I mean, the gospel saying, hey, here's Jesus, you can accept him or not. That is predicated on this idea of consent. Like we have to accept and say yes for him to come into our life. He doesn't like force himself upon us. And so knowing who God is and how he creates people and trusting him, knowing that, believing that the Bible is the truth and Jesus epitomizes everything about the law, is the foundation of the sex ed that I teach. And it all comes from him, his word, his knowledge, that he shares with us, and not just from like a sense of right and wrong and a sense of wanting to treat everyone equally. No, like we know why we're meant to treat everyone with love. And that's because we're made in God's image. And that's a much bigger truth and a much more core truth than just like, oh, let's just care about everybody and let them all do what they want and live whatever their truth is. That's how the world operates, and it's different.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So purity culture teaches and has taught that somehow, you as a woman are responsible for your response. Like, don't wear your skirt too short, don't wear your, top too
Right.
short or deep or whatever. And you're also responsible for yourself and keeping yourself pure, because if for some reason you have sex or you kiss or whatever your Christian church believes, you are now defiled and unworthy. And so this it's interesting because I really am doing this series with women in mind, but I'm finding that there are a lot of men who are also listening who are like, well, you know what? Struggled as well. I was taught as a man that I couldn't talk about my feelings. I couldn't talk about, any kind of sexual intimacy. And so like now that my kids are we have kids, I am just totally leaving that to the mom, to the wife, because I'm not comfortable in my own skin. And so I'm just putting it off. But I think that your curriculum is designed for both, right?
Absolutely. It is designed for both. Yes.
Yeah. Are you seeing that kind of in some of the people that you're talking to and the families that you're working with as well?
Yes. There has been a lot of fallout from the methodologies that we grew up in and the teachings we took in, like the little sponges we were, like most children. And we, I don't think purity culture teachers or the students of purity culture could have ever predicted fully where we would be, 10, 20 years later, which of course was parenting. That part we could have predicted for many of us and married for many of us, but like with so much kind of trauma and pain and hurt and shame and mixed messages about sex and even mixed messages about God. If I do this for God, then I'll earn this, or like I'll earn his favor, or I'll be good enough. Or if I wait until marriage, I will have a good sex life. Or, it didn't take into account abuse. It didn't take into account manipulation, peer pressure, really. It told people what to feel instead of really helping them to understand what sex and sexuality are for and why they're for that. And so I just think it absolutely 100% really missed the mark for the vast majority of students, and we're still carrying some of that. And so I really encourage parents to unpack their own stuff, right? Unpack your own. I'm sure you've talked about this in a recent podcast you've done. Maybe that haven't quite come out yet at the time that we're filming this, but um, unpacking your own like trauma that you've had around sex, or your own fear-based messaging, or unpacking the teachings that were not helpful to you, or that maybe taught you your body was inherently bad just because you have like breast, right? Or that men will do this because they're men and women will do this because they're women, when like maybe there was some nuance to that and that wasn't totally true. And so I always encourage couples, if you're married, to really talk about what did we learn like individually, and how is that impacting us today, and how is that impacting our parenting around this specific topic.
Mm-hmm.
Like what are we going to do about that? Have you ever really dove in or dived into how your sex ed is impacting you in 2026? Because I bet you it is in more ways than you think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that you brought up a really good point. So, if you come into a marriage and you have all these expectations, we talked about how statistically women, especially, they hear when they were raised in purity culture, they hear sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad. And then you get married and it's hard to switch that mindset over to, oh, wait, no, sex is good, sex is wonderful, right? And so I love that point that you brought up that, really as a couple, you need to kind of come together and decide and go overcome some of the feelings that you have. Really talk about that so that it's not filtering through to your kids, and so that you can be a lot more comfortable talking about those things that, that come up.
Yes, and so that you can be on the same
Yeah.
page. And I would very much encourage like a date night, or after the kids are all in bed, multiple nights where you're having this conversation, because you probably think you know what your husband or wife learned, but you probably don't fully. There's more messaging that and it's not just from our teachers in school or in church. We learned from our parents. We learned from society. We learned from our friends and neighbors what sex and sexuality meant. And so continuing to just say, this is the honest truth about what I still think I learned from that. I mean, my husband and I were married for a decade before we really, and I'm a sex ed teacher and he's a physician. And we talk about these topics all the time with patients or students. It was a decade of marriage before we really dug in and said, wait, hold up. Like, what did you learn growing up? And he started talking about things we had never talked about before, when he was 5, 6, 7 years old. Um, and so it might just be that one person hasn't fully unpacked or that, but it's so helpful. It's so helpful in a relationship as well. Like that's another bonus of really doing this well is that it actually helps in your relationship too. Because I mean, you hear this over and over, but what are the main things couples fight about? Money, kind of family, in-laws stuff, and sex. And so really unpacking what you learned, even if you've done this before, but it was years ago, again, to help you understand and get you on the same page. And then, yes, it will help your parenting.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that that also brings up another point of those women who are listening and men too, for that matter, who are thinking about getting married, right? They've never been married. Like those conversations are so incredibly crucial to have before you walk down the aisle. And then if you already walked
Yes.
down the aisle, you're already married, also crucial conversations to talk about as your kids are asking different questions because today's kids are so much different in the environment that they're being raised in than I was in the 90s. That
Yeah.
there's so many things online. There's so many things that are happening in schools. There's so many, and I know that a lot of Christian parents hope they could just bubble wrap it and just like let's just keep them home or let's just limit their interactions, which is good, but also really being able to build that trust with your child so that when things come up, because they're going to, even if you keep them home and homeschool, and even if like things are going to happen in a grocery store or different places where they're going to ask questions, and you need to be able to have that relationship where you can have those conversations.
Yes, I totally.
What in your so in your curriculum, it's not just this is what you this is this body part, this is what the function is, this is you really, I love that you really encourage a lot of conversation, a lot of introspection on different things. Can you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, so this curriculum is for children. It is video content to play for your kids. And it comes in 4 different packages, if you will, or 4 different curriculum. There's a 3 to 6 year old curriculum. So this is very basic information for young kids to help them to be safe, to help them to be healthy, and to help them get a really basic understanding of how God made their body well. And this is a great place to start if you have a 3 to 6 year old. Now, if you don't start there. You start at whatever age your child is. So I also have a 7 to 10, 11 to 13, and 14 to 18. And each of these have different content that are appropriate for that age. And so I taught them in the appropriate setting because I've taught in all childhood classrooms, like for all ages. And the way that you teach this information, of course, is very sensitive. And so it's different based on how old they are. An 11-year-old is going to have really different questions than a 17-year-old who's going to have different questions than a 6-year-old. And the way you respond is, of course, different too. But it's honest. It's always honest. I'm never making things up. I'm never lying. I'm never like, stepping around the topic. Like you said, we call anatomy what it is. We name things what they are, but it's much bigger than that because it's also about identity and it's about caring about others and healthy dating and what are red flags and what is grooming and how do people fall into sexting and sextortion and why is it that Christians might even seek out abortions? Like, how does that happen? And so it really explores the issue from a more holistic viewpoint of, okay, this isn't just right and wrong and these are bad and these are good and this is what that's called and that's what that's called. We need to actually dig into this a bit and say, how does this happen in our world? Why does this even happen in Christian communities? How can we avoid this? How can we pray about this? How can we prevent this? But also, what does my life matter to that topic? Like, would I ever sext? Would I ever get an abortion? And it's like most people just say, well, no, my kid would never do that, or I would never do that. But the reality is that kids do, and that people do. And so I really want kids to think about that, like critically. and to engage with the material. And that's why every single video of my lessons, all my lessons have critical engagement questions where you pause the video, even if your kid is 4 and you're watching with them, and they answer. And there's workbooks and things like that to go with curriculum too. But it's really helping kids explore the nuances of the topic in their mind and understand what the foundation is and where to build from, right? Because, for example, if your feelings are who you are, then that means what you feel tomorrow is who you are. But if your feelings are an indicator of how you are, not who you are, then that's a very different standpoint. And that relates to sexuality in today's day and age. And most parents don't even think about that, right? And so it just really incorporates this kind of nuance, if you will, in.
Okay, so, but talk to the parent who's listening and is thinking, okay, but if we fan the fuel of curiosity, isn't that going to make them want to have sex more?
That's a great question, and it's really, really common. And the answer is no, it doesn't. Um, what makes them want to have sex more is their sinful flesh, it's their body, it's the world around them. It is not having healthy and like righteous and holy conversations about this topic. Now, I get the kind of idea behind it. For example, if you talk about porn, are your kids suddenly going to be interested in what it is? I can't guarantee that every child I talk to about porn isn't like going to go and have more questions about it, which that's part of actually the hope, but I can't guarantee that none of them are going to look. And that's really scary for parents. But the reality is that pretty much 100% of this generation is going to see porn. Okay. But what foundation they start from, where they learn about it from, like where they first hear about it from, that matters because most people hear about sex and hear about porn and hear about, name, fill in the blank from bad sources, from sources that are encouraging them to do those things, from sources that are telling them it's not that big of a deal or go for it, or that it's really sexy and fun and exciting to do whatever. And so go ahead. They're not hearing from, hey, this is what this stuff is. And this is why I don't want you to look it up, or this is why it's not okay to go and blah, blah, blah. Like, give them all the boundaries around it. That's fine. And you know your kids best, right? And so you know maybe which kids would be more likely to, I don't know, be really curious about something and not go to a good source versus which kid will listen. But you have that in mind as you're talking to them. And it's way better that it comes from you first than you just avoiding it because you're afraid. Avoiding good conversations because we're afraid is not ultimately healthy or helpful for our children.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. And I also like, that encouraging curiosity also encourages questions, right? So like if you are teaching porn is bad, porn is bad, porn is bad, porn is bad, and not why or what, the human side of it
Yeah.
or whatever that looks like, and having those conversations, because you're right, 100% that porn's going to come up in so many different ways, right? And so just it's like helping your child prepare for battle and being open to have them ask any questions that they need to. And I get that sometimes it's like super uncomfortable. And so, I always tell parents, if you have to have those uncomfortable conversations, the best time to do that is in the car where you're facing like this, you're not facing across from each other, and you can kind of have an open discussion about different things like that.
Yes. Yep. No eye contact.
So realistically, at what age should parents start talking about sex and their bodies and different things like that?
Whenever your kid starts asking is one way to know, but their bodies, it should start from the get-go. I mean, when you're changing their diapers, changing your diaper, only mommy and daddy should change your diaper. Only people we love and care about should change your diaper. Nobody, my 4-year-old knew that nobody should ever take pictures of her or videos of her without her clothes on, that's not okay, that's disrespectful, that's rude, that nobody should ever show her pictures, right? And so you're getting at basic kind of grooming prevention when kids are really little, because that helps them to be safe. Kids who know their anatomy, who know language, who feel safe and with their parents to talk about those things are much more likely to quickly either report or avoid and prevent those situations than kids who are vulnerable because they don't know anything. That's just the truth at the end of the day. And then sex, I mean, again, I have a video of this on my Instagram of sex ed reclaimed and my Facebook, but it's my 3-year-old asking where babies come from. And I talk about how to handle that. I talk about sperm and eggs and them meeting, and that's what makes a baby. 2 ingredients, kind of like we use ingredients to make brownies. And that was really all she wanted to know. How does sperm get to the egg? Oh, they swim. Okay. They have a tail. They look like little tadpoles. So you can really start talking about things young when they're curious and it won't ruin their lives. In fact, they'll be just fine. It's better off when they're little and they don't have a lot of shame tied into it than when they're like 14 and now they still don't know. And I have lived experiences of talking to teenagers who didn't know anything, and it's not good. It's not good.
Yeah.
Like I said, those kids are more vulnerable. And so even if they're 14, right? And so you really need to broach those topics with your children as they question it and as the opportunities arise.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think this actually came up in a mom's group that I was leading this week. And just talking about how do we tell our kids about sex and how much is too much information and how can you do it realistically in a way that they can understand. And so I love that you touched on that because I think that that is a really common question.
Yes.
So,
and I think that's where I'm sorry. I think that's where my curriculum comes in. It's just providing all the conversations for them.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And, and you're building a relationship. It's not like, in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s when it was like, okay, we're going to sit down, we're going to have this talk, right? It's about having those conversations and building that relationship. Yeah. So when things come up when they're teenagers and they're dating, or when things come up when they see things in at school or in the community, they feel you've already had those conversations. So it's not awkward. It's like, oh, we just talk about these things. And it just kind of, flows.
Yes, exactly.
So what is one of the number one things that you see that Christian parents make? What's the biggest mistake that Christian parents make when approaching sex and the topics of our bodies and those different pieces?
I think I've mentioned them woven throughout this podcast, but they avoid it. They don't teach the truth. An example of this would be I saw a Christian radio station post about how to answer your child when they ask what sex is, why a Christian radio station was doing that, I don't know, but they sure were. And the host pretends that she's a kid and says, "Mom, what's sex?" And they're like, "Oh gosh, nobody wants this question. This is awful." Which is not even a great way to start that. And I mean, they're acknowledging the feelings, but they're making it seem like it's doomsday when it's not. It's an opportunity for discipleship. But anyway, they go, "Oh, you tell them that it's like it's a heavy bag and it's too heavy for them to carry." And I'm like, that's not true. And then there was another one I saw, and this was from a Christian, actually, sex ed company, and they said, "Mom, what's a virgin?" How would you answer, "Mom, what's a virgin?" You say it's somebody who is not married. I'm like, that is not true.
Right.
That's just not true. I get that in a perfect world, that would be, but that we live in an abusive world. We live in a non-consensual world. We live in a world where people, have sex before they get married, and Christians do too. And so we need to acknowledge a virgin is somebody who's never had sex. You say it. And so anyway, that's easier if you've already had some conversations around the body and around sex, right? Or it's somebody who's never done the special activity it takes to make a baby. But there's just no point in like lying. And a lot of even Christian groups kind of encourage that for the comfort of who? The parent, not the child. So those are mistakes I see, even in my specific faith background. And I would say the other big one is avoidance. It's just assuming your kids don't need that. I had a comment the other day on a post on Facebook, I believe. It might have been Instagram. Whatever. Either way, a woman commented to me and she said, I always avoid organizations that say should. And I'm like, that's a weird standard for avoiding an organization. So I was like, well, that's too bad because you really should have these conversations with your kid. That's
Exactly.
not like an ultimatum. I'm not trying to guilt trip you or shame you. I'm just saying you should. Like you should.
Yeah.
Like kind of go down there. But you could just tell that has a lot more to do with her, than it does with like her kids or me as an organization or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, the whole virgin question is such an incredible opportunity to talk about so many things, right? What is it?
Yeah.
And you can either go one way and have it be a great conversation or not and have it just be this incredible pressure because virginity is such a sensitive topic, right? It's like um it is an
Yes.
opportunity to show the grace of God. And, like this is what a virgin is, it's someone who's never had sex, that part. But also that piece around, but if you're in a situation where you have sex before marriage, there's still grace in what God has to say. It's not, all or
Yeah.
nothing, black or white. You can get married, live a great godly life, and not be a virgin when you get married, right? So like I think that
Right,
these
right.
questions that your kids are coming up with are like a small piece of a big puzzle, right? So you can talk about all different things and open. It's such a great opportunity to open up these conversations that might be uncomfortable but your kids are struggling with it, and we need to be able to come alongside them.
Yes, I totally agree. You're right. You could really get into some interesting conversation depending on the age of the child around just that word, virgin, and what virginity, like what that's tied into and tied into self-worth and all of these kinds of things. And why does God say that sex is just for marriage? Like it could become a really fruitful, beautiful conversation.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Okay, so you have said that education is prevention. And in practical terms, what does grooming awareness look like when you're teaching a 7-year-old versus a 14-year-old?
Um, it it looks at how grooming would happen. So for a 14-year-old, it's much more likely to happen in a dating relationship or online in some sort of capacity on a device. For a 7-year-old, it's much more likely to happen in person. Now, granted, both can happen in person, right? A 14-year-old, I would be much more upfront and blunt about, let's say they have teachers or they're around adults, right? Like, what does it look like for an adult to do that? In my curriculum, I tell them, right? If a teacher is like pressuring you to have a relationship, if they're touching you, if they're making you feel uncomfortable or like they're interested in, you more than just as a student. So I use really kind of clear language actually to say like this is what grooming is in a teacher student relationship or in an adult child relationship. I talk about healthy relationships too. Would you want to date somebody 5 years older than you? Why or why not? Why might that be a bad idea? And then for a 7-year-old, I talk a lot more about nobody should ever take pictures or videos of you. If you do go on a device and somebody asks for your information, should you ever give it? No, that's not safe. That's not good for you. Because sometimes kids have access to things like Roblox, and Roblox is really sexualized, and all sorts of weird stuff happens when you're gaming with people from all over the world. And so it really depends on the child and their devices. But in my curriculum, I teach generally like what it looks like and what a safe relationship, respectful relationship looks like versus what one where somebody's being manipulative looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think that, the other just because I've helped several families whose girls have been trafficked online, we just are living in such a different
Yeah.
world, right? And just talking about what is that, like say a healthy relationship is not somebody that you never see, right? A healthy relationship is you can't have a relationship with somebody online. That is a more intimate relationship than just friendships. And having those conversations are so important too. So
Yes.
you recently posted that in just 90 days, public figures who spoke against abuse were exposed for the very behavior they condemned. How does that really shape the conversations that you're having with parents?
I am a very realistic person. Like I look at the world and I don't think our kids are as guarded from it as we think that they are. We don't live in the 1950s when like your neighborhood was it. We live in a very, very, very digital connected, overconnected maybe age where we see and hear about everything all the time. And so, yes, for example, in the last that post you're talking about in the last 3 months, these are the I have like images of all the people I've seen, men and women, who have been convicted or going to court around a sexual offense or assault. And in many cases, they're Christian leaders. And I do that specifically just to say that, like, nowhere's really safe. You need to talk to your kids because you don't have control over other people, but you have some control over what your kids know and understand and hear. And so making sure that they are empowered themselves to actually prevent these kind of situations and behaviors and talk about them if they see anything, or even for a friend of theirs, right? You mentioned human trafficking. I think all the time about not just these kids who are learning about human trafficking, but the ways that they might impact their friends. They might see red flags in their friendships that I never would have known about when I was a kid because nobody ever talked to me about what trafficking was. So if I'd had a girlfriend who was, dating an older boy and I was worried about her, I would have never thought in my head, oh, maybe like, is there a trafficking situation going on? Because I didn't even know what it was. Whereas in reality, that could actually prevent a bad thing from happening. And so, yeah, I I want kids to not only be prepared for themselves, but to actually look around the world and be able to help others too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the idea that there are leaders in the Christian church who are struggling with deeper
Right.
issues than just sexual abuse, but that it's everywhere, right? And that
Yeah.
Jesus extends grace to everyone. However, we also need to be aware of our surroundings and aware of who we're exposing our kids to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, how do you look at the tension between God's design for sexuality and meeting kids where they actually are in the hypersexualized world that we live in?
This is a really great question. It's like, how do we talk about the world while still living in the Christian faith? I think the same way the Bible does. The Bible recognizes all sorts of crazy stuff going on in the world and in the Christian people in the Bible, the prophets and the leaders, by stating it, and it states it pretty plainly, right? And so I do think we have to just simply say, like, I know that this is what other kids are doing, or I know that, or recognize, for example, this is a question that would recognize the reality of the world without like demonizing it, I guess. So saying like, hey, I know that there's a lot of people who watch, maybe you're talking to a teen. I know there's a lot of people who watch porn. And I've heard that the average age of exposure the first time a kid sees it is like 11 or 12. Do you have an exposure to porn? Have you seen that before? And like, how old were you? Right. And so you acknowledge a lot of people watch this, a lot of people have seen it. But exposure, you're insinuating exposure is not a good thing. Like that's way too young for somebody to see this kind of material. But have you seen it? And even if they're like, no, no, right, and they don't answer, you've now opened up that communication pathway for them to potentially come back to you and say, you know what, once when I went to a sleepover at so and so's house, actually there was a couple kids showing it on their phones or something like that. You're starting to make it a safe space if you've never done that before where they can talk about this. And so you recognize, okay, this is going on in the world. Like maybe you watch a show and there's sexual material in it. And you say, oh my goodness, like that couple, it seems like that couple, they're insinuating that they're already having sex. Like, when do you think people should start having sex? And you ask them and they say, well, when they're married. And say, okay, well, do you know why our family believes that? Right. And so you're just keeping that conversation open and almost light, like your tone is light and you're very receptive and you are trustworthy because you're not like condemning them or judging the world or shaming them. You're saying like this is happening. So let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And let's talk about what you think and what worldview you're starting to form.
I love that. Yep, that is so true. That is so true. So your curriculum is used on all 50 states and in 14 countries. And it clearly resonates with different Christian cultures, right? Because as the different, like I just talked to a woman from India who's raised in a Christian church in India, which looks very different from here. So I think that's cool. So what is the universal thread that goes through, that bypasses all cultural differences?
Hmm. That's a really fun question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. I think it's that we're all created as sexual beings. Like we all have sexual desires and sexual parts and um, interest in our sexuality, like dating and, maybe marriage and relationships. And so we all have this desire that we're born with. And if you believe the Bible is true, then you know that's true, that God made us this way. And so we want to know about it. Like we're curious about it. I mean, the Bible talks about sex. Like everybody jokes about Song of Solomon, but it does. It talks about this like romantic couple who loves each other and enjoys sex together. And there are certain parts of the body that God clearly made just, for pleasure on the woman's body. And so that means that we're innately interested in it. And I think that's the thread that goes across all cultures, no matter the language or the how conservative or liberal or what their politics are, or what the schooling looks like, or, certainly what their skin color or income level is. Like, no, like we're all humans who have this innate desire and interest, and we want to know more. And even from a young age, we know this. Kids want to know. And it is okay to answer them. In fact, it really honors them and honors them well. And it is better than what many of us got.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's also that universal, no matter where you live as a parent, you want what's best for your kids. You want to give your kids the best information. You
Yes.
want to have that conversation. You want to have a relationship with them, especially in those teen years where they're, you know, pulling back, moving forward, pulling back, moving forward. They're like, I hate you, mom. I love you. I hate you. I need you, And so, that's
Yeah.
universal, whether you live in China or whether you live in New Zealand or whether you live here in the United States. So, being able to make those connections over something that they're inundated with all the time, I think is so incredibly magical. So, what is
Yeah.
reclaiming sex and look like 10 years from now if you could have like a time machine you could go forward, what do you think it looks like if your
I
vision
think it looks like
if your vision fully
families are,
takes
yeah,
hold, people start like looking at your curriculum and they're like, okay, so what do you think the difference will be in 10 years?
I think it looks like kids saying, my parents taught me about sex and they did a really great job.
Yeah.
Or my church taught me about sex and did a good job. Because I very rarely, if ever, have heard that from anyone. Um, And so I think it looks like healthy relationships between parents and children as far as it goes with this topic. It looks like families who have open conversations, who are really exploring this. It looks like kids who are less likely to walk away from the church because they have questions and issues around sex and sexuality that were never answered. Instead, they were. They feel safe there. They feel like trusted, like God cares about this. It looks like healthier marriages. Like I see a lot of the big picture kind of stuff for whatever reason. I'm actually not really a big picture person in general. I tend to be more in like the here and now, but thinking about what this can do long term, the potential porn addiction it could prevent, potential betrayals it could prevent, like all of that is what reclaiming healthy sex ed actually looks like. It looks, yes, I've said prevention a lot in our time together, but it looks like people who are healthy and who are living whole, and not compartmentalized and disjointed.
I love that. Okay, so if a parent is listening to this right now and they've never had one single conversation with their kid about sex, what is one thing that you want them to do today?
I want them to pray. I want them to consider what starting looks like. I want them to consider if it's acknowledging the elephant in the room. Hey, we've never talked about this before, but I really want to because I listened to this podcast or because I heard this or because I know that when I was a kid, I didn't have this and I want you to have. So maybe it's acknowledging the elephant in the room. Maybe it's just making yourself use a simple opportunity around you. Like, a gay couple you see or a person who seems to be trans or something sexual in the media or, asking their kid, what do you think about that? Hey, what do you think about that? Or what do you know about transgender? Do you know any other gay couples or whatever? Just like a simple question to get them talking and to get them um, in an understanding that their parent does care about this and they do talk about it. Because if you're talking about it, it shows that you care and it shows that you have interest and it shows that you want to know them more deeply. And those are beautiful, godly things, actually. And so I think it looks like taking that first step. Yeah, pray about it, talk about it with your spouse, kind of unpack your own stuff for sure. If and when you can, ideally very soon, but also just like take the first step and start to have these conversations with great regularity. It's way easier when you can do it in 100 little conversations than when you have to do it one big weekend or something.
Yeah, I love that. So, for those parents that are listening or even youth pastors, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I love what Kristen's saying. I really would love to just get to know more about her program. We can implement it into our
Mhm.
Christian school or whatever that looks like. Can you give us the link so that I can put that in the description?"
Yes. So anybody who's interested, if you're on social media, you can follow Sex Ed Reclaimed on wherever you're looking at socials, except on TikTok. Which, fun fact, I was blocked on TikTok because I was teaching kids what grooming was, and TikTok blocked me. Isn't that strange? Really creepy. Anyway, otherwise, you can find me on my website at www.sexedreclaimed.com. You can get free samples there of my younger curriculum or my older curriculum, and then you'll be added to like a basic few, like I think there's 6 emails that you'll get just to kind of see and look through. You can always email me through my website if you have like a specific interest. I want to see how you talk about abortion with kids who are between 7 and 10, because that's how old my kids are. You can just email me and let me know. Um, and I'm very reachable there.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Thank you so much for being here today and talking about some things that sometimes are uncomfortable for parents. I appreciate you.